This is just a quick and simple tutorial to explain a little bit about bias binding, what it is, how to cut it, how to apply it, and how to miter corners. If you weren't aware, bias binding is the contrast normally fabric that you see around the edges of bag flaps. You can use it in dressmaking, around necks and armholes, and you'll certainly see this in binding quilts. By cutting on a 45-degree angle, that means that as you go around the curve, you don't get any puckering. So you'll have a tape that sits around the edge of things like a bag flap that sit perfectly without any kind of puckering up all the way around. To be honest, if you are binding a quilt like this doesn't need to be cut on the bias because there are no curves involved. So you may be able to save yourself a little bit of fabric by doing it this way. So there's lots of different ways of cutting the fabric, there's lots of different ways of applying, but I just wanted to keep this really simple for those of you that have been a little bit fearful maybe of using bias binding. So let me just explain right at the beginning that a woven fabric has a warp, which is the thread that goes from north to south, and it has a weft, which is the thread that goes from east to west, or weft to right is a good way of remembering it. And when you cut at these angles, and a lot of the time with patterns, if you're using them, they will say cut on the grain, you're going to cut at this angle, and there's very little movement in the fabric. If you cut at a 45-degree angle, so we turn this over, it gives the fabric a little bit of stretch, which allows you again to go around the curves without it puckering. So the bias line is the 45-degree line, and that's why we like to use bias binding. So let's just put this to one side and I'll show you how to cut. Ideally, you're going to need a 24-inch ruler, a cutting mat, the larger you have the better, and a rotary cutter to cut with. It makes life so much easier, particularly if you're doing lots and lots of meterage or yardage of the binding. Now on your mat you should have a 45-degree line which you can use. So all you need to do is to place your fabric with the grain going up and down and across, then your ruler across here, across that 45-degree line, and then you can make your first cut across here. Alternatively, you can use your ruler by placing the 45-degree mark, which is this one here, let me just turn that over, the 45-degree mark here against the edge of your fabric, and then cut across this diagonal line here. So that's how I'm going to do this. I'm just going to slide that across. When you've made your first cut, you don't need so much your mat anymore. So I'll just recut that so it's a little straighter. That's better. Always better to stand up when you're cutting, I find. Right, and then I'm going to make 2-inch strips of fabric. Of course you can make the binding in lots of different widths. I tend to use this one most of all. So I'm using the 2-inch line on my ruler to now cut a 2-inch piece of fabric. Move the ruler across and use that 2-inch line again to cut a 2-inch length of fabric. When it comes to the stage where your fabric is too big for your mat, then you can fold this in half, make sure the edges are lined up perfectly, place your 2-inch ruler here and cut straight across. Now for joining these pieces together, which invariably you will, I mean there are other ways of cutting this. You can cut in a round, which is a very cost-effective way of making bias binding. I'm just going to keep it really simple for this demonstration. But to join these together, well, the first thing I'm going to do is to cut off the selvage because I don't use that. Let's cut this off and we'll join these 3 pieces together. So we're going to have them right sides together, like so, and overlap them slightly, which again may seem a little bit wasteful, but this will make sense in just a second. I'm going to pop a pin in here. Don't have to do that every time. And then draw a line, and again don't have to draw a line every time when you get used to doing this, but that's going to go diagonally from one of these corners to the other. whoops, that's my ruler, and then we'll sew across that diagonal line. And I'm using quite a small stitch, so 2.2 on this machine. So sew straight across here from corner to corner. Now I can take out the pin. I'm going to cut quite close to the seam, so maybe just 1/4 of an inch away, and snip off those little ends there, and then that needs to be pressed. So I've got a nice neat finish there. So let's do that again with my next piece. So right sides together. I'm not going to pin this time, literally sew from one corner to another. You'll get used to doing this the more that you do. You'll be doing less pinning and less drawing as you go. And trim this back. Okay, then we need to fold it. So I'm just going to take my ironing pad here. So a couple of tips for you, just putting the iron on. If your fabric doesn't crease too well, then give it a spray of starch, or I like to use Best Press because I like the smell, or maybe dampen with a damp cloth. We really want this to crease very well. And then the idea is to fold in half and press to find the centre. I'm just going to one side with that seam allowance. I think that's fine. And then the two long sides now need to be folded to the centre. Now if you're doing a lot of binding, so that wasn't quite straight, this can be quite time consuming. So if you're only binding around something like the bag flap I showed you earlier on, then that won't take very long at all. But if you're doing a lot of binding, that's going to take quite a long time, which is where something like this comes into effect. So this time we feed the pointy end into the tape maker. In you go. They have a gap in them here, which is handy to just poke a pin in and push the fabric out. Let's go around this side. So give it a little bit of room each side to just allow, that's it, to get the fold going. So always cut your fabric longer than you need it to be. And then the iron goes on that side, and you're just going to slowly pull the binding maker along the fabric, and it's automatically folding the edges to the centre. So that's a much easier way. You can buy bias binding makers, electronic ones. They tend to be quite expensive. So I think this is probably the best way to do it. I'm just going to press that seam as I'm coming to it there. The only thing with these, they don't like seams very much. So when you come to it, it may not flatten perfectly, but that's when you can just go in there and do that with your fingers, and then carry on the rest of the way. So it does make light work. These come in different sizes as well. I'm using a 2.5 centimetre or a 1 inch, because I'm making 1 inch binding here. But you can go larger, you can go smaller. And this is a single fold bias binding. So let me explain the difference. With a single fold, it may seem a little bit odd calling it a single fold when you've got 2 folds of fabric. But basically, where this is folded around the edge of your work, there is one single fold of fabric here. So that's why it's called single fold. A double fold binding is actually just another piece of fabric. Your binding fabric, this is a little bit wider, folded in half. And then when this is applied around the edge of particularly a quilt, you get 2 rows of fabric here. So that's why it's called double fold. And double fold binding you would usually use when you're making a quilt, because you have that extra layer of fabric around the edge, so it means it's going to last longer and wear better, basically. So that's your bias binding, and that's now made. So a 1-inch bias binding, if your project or your pattern asks for 1-inch bias binding, then you need to start off with 2 inches of fabric, but then you'll need a 1-inch bias binding maker. And when this is folded around the edge of your work, it actually ends up as 1/2 inch wide. So it all seems a little bit confusing, but if you need 1-inch bias binding, cut 2 inches of fabric. So let's pop this around a small quilt, just to show you how I apply it. Again, lots of different ways, some more complicated than this. I just wanted to keep everything really simple for you here. So let's take our quilt, and apparently the best place to start is going to be the left-hand side in the centre, because that's the area of your quilt that's the least noticeable, because the eye is drawn to the right. So let's take the end of our binding. I'm going to fold this over, only by about 1/2 inch, and crease, and then place this along the edge of my fabric. And I'm not going to pin it, I'm just going to line the raw edges up together and sew along this crease. When I come to the corner here, because I'm mitering the corners, I'm going to stop sewing 1/2 inch from the edge, because this is 1/2 inch wide. I'm going to start 1/2 inch from here. If your bias binding is narrower or wider, whatever width this is here, you're going to stop sewing from the end right there, do a couple of back stitches and take your work out. So let's do this. So again, the end's folded over so it makes it nice and neat when I come back to the beginning. You'll see that shortly. Line up the edges here, and so just coming up to the corner. So again, I'm going to stop 1/2 inch, go backwards and snip. Let's take this out. Then we need to line up the edges. So we'll fold this around the corner so that the raw edges are still meeting. I've got a fold across the top of here, and I've created a triangle in the corner. And all of this should sit nice and square. And then from the crease line here, I'm going to carry on sewing until I get to 1/2 inch from the opposite end. So again, stop with the needle down if you need to stop. Be careful not to pull the binding, because again, this is cut on the bias, it will stretch, so it has got a little bit of give in here. I don't want to pull it, I want it to lay flat. Come up to 1/2 inch from the edge. You'll be able to gauge that the more you do it and the more you get used to it. Take it out. Turn all of this around so that the raw edges meet up. Make that little triangular flap in the corner, and then we'll carry on sewing right down that crease line. I think with any kind of binding, it's such a lovely finishing touch. Something like a quilt, even a small mat like this, which could be a placemat or a sewing machine mat, you wouldn't be able to hem that because it's got wadding in the centre, and you need to fold that over twice to create a neat hem. That's just far too thick, so binding really comes into its own. But I love the professional finish to it. I love that contrast border that looks like your work's just been outlined. And a mitred corner just gives you such a professional finish. But it's got to be done properly. So again, down into this corner, stopping 1/2 inch from the edge. Take your work out and turn it around. Now when I come back down to where I started, these two pieces are overlapping too much, or it's better to be too long than too short. So I'm going to snip this off so that it overlaps by about 1/2 inch, and then carry on sewing until I get back to the same stitch line where I started. And now when I turn these corners over, you'll see that beautiful mitred corner on every corner, no puckering, no gathering. And again, this is straight, so it doesn't have to be bias cut. It would have been ideal to avoid this seam there, but you know, these things happen. and then where I started I can just overlap so I get a nice neat finish there as well. Now on the back of here I prefer to hand sew, which may seem quite time consuming. Personally I enjoy it. This is a kind of relaxation time for me, doing a little bit of hand sewing. If you prefer to machine stitch, then I would suggest that you hand tack or baste this first of all, because, let me show you, when this folds over, so this is obviously the wrong side of my work, when it folds over and you machine sew here, you can't guarantee that you're going to get a perfect line across here, so you need to sew from the top. So you've got two choices. You can either apply the bias binding from the wrong side, so this could be the wrong side of the fabric, and then fold this over to the right side and top stitch here, so you know the right side's going to look good. If you wanted to do it this way around, then I would overlap my fabric just over that seam and press it, and then hand tack it, and then sew from this side, so that you know that you're going to catch all of the fabric on the back. But if you like a bit of hand sewing like I do, this is what we're going to do. And I'll just sew around the corner just to show you how it works. So I'm going to take my needle into the seam allowance so I can hide the knot, and then fold the fabric over. And again, I just want to cover that stitch line. If you find that this fabric is too thick, you can trim it down, don't worry about that. So pull it over, then I'm going to go into the main fabric and out, and then just catch the fold of the binding. Directly underneath this stitch, I'm going to go back into the main fabric. I'm not going all the way through, and then back out again around about 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters apart, and carry on doing this all the way around. Colour wise of thread, this is a little bit bright for my binding. Choose the same colour as your binding, or if you've got a patterned fabric, then you could go for a neutral, like a grey, a cream or a beige, and they tend to be the most invisible colours. But if you're going to see any stitches at all, you're going to see them on the binding side, so best to match that as closely as you can. So let's just come up to the corner, and I'm holding this in place. It kind of wants to sit in a diagonal, and in the mitred corner, so it's not an effort to make it do that. But when I come up to the seam here, I like to put a stitch right in the corner to secure that. Then we'll fold this over. Oh, I love that, really nice neat corner. And then I like to put another stitch in there to hold the corner in place before I carry on sewing. So it doesn't actually take that long. Obviously if you're going to make a large quilt, then that is quite a lot of time taken up, but personally I think it's worth it. And it is a technique that I use an awful lot. So you can see that's going to look really nice and neat on the wrong side, and perfectly neat on the outside as well. When I come to, I shan't sew that now because I'm here. When I come to the overlap here, again that folds over, that folds over, and I do the same again. I like to put just an extra little stitch in the fold where it turns over, just to ensure that that's not going to come undone. So that is bias binding briefly, but I hope it's explained a little bit about bias binding, what it is, what you use it for, and how simple it actually is. So if you have been a little bit fearful, or you find it rather daunting to use bias binding, then go get your rotary cutter ruler and mat, cut up your fabric, and let's get binding. It's a lot easier than you think it'll be. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.